All right, I am back. I've got my office almost unpacked, still getting things ready, dealing with another new camera setup as I acclimate to Texas, and I'm here for Ask the Pastor. So I've got another new question that I'm really excited to answer from a new friend of the channel, Jonathan Etheridge. I hope I'm saying that right, Jonathan. He asks, I was wondering if you could ever do a video explaining what the image of God actually is. And yeah, I'll do a video about that right now. That's what I do here. People ask me questions and I do my best to answer them as a pastor. So we're talking about the Imago Dei, which is a Latin term for the image of God, because that theology has become important, especially in the Roman Catholic tradition, where they speak a lot of Latin. What is the image of God? Well, biblically speaking, there's not a lot to be said. It's a concept and theology that is built out of the creation story in Genesis, during which God says, "Let us make him in our image and our likeness." The Hebrew words there aren't especially helpful. They mean image and likeness. So there's something about us that resembles God. And then that idea is mentioned a couple other times in Scripture, but it's really relying on the Genesis 1 through 3 narrative for what the other parts of Scripture say, right? Because this is one of the earliest parts of Scripture that other parts of Scripture then continue to comment upon. Theologically, if you want to talk about what the image of God actually is, there's lots of good answers. So if you read what John Calvin has to say, he has a take, or Maimonides. But of course, the fact that different theologians go in different directions with this is kind of a good indication that they don't really know, right? Like if this was something that was clear from the Bible and it was just a matter of articulating it, one of them would have said it, and the others would have maybe said it a little differently, but had like the same basic idea. But the fact that they're going in different directions means that it's something that's open to interpretation, that there is interpretive room here. Now, I want to be careful when I say, something like John Calvin doesn't know what the image of God is here in a video where I'm telling you what the image of God is. I'm not saying, when I say theologians don't know, I'm not saying that what they have to say is of no value, or that it doesn't contain any level of truth. Rather that the value that it has isn't explanatory value to articulate what the Bible has to say in new words, but it could have immense value in terms of like entering into the Reformed school of theology, right? If we orient our whole theological mind around a concept like soli Deo gloria, to the glory of God alone, what will that cause us to believe about the image of God? And we can read Calvin and see how he addresses that question, and that can help to illuminate other aspects of Reformed theology. Similar with Maimonides, right? He is the Rambam. He is one of the most beloved and treasured explicators of the Torah that there is. And so to enter into the school of Maimonides and understand his take on the image of God has enormous value. It just might not necessarily be what's true, if that makes sense. So probably more helpful to you than me like reciting off what the various takes of all of these people are, Wikipedia's got a good article on it if you want that, would be to talk about what game it is they're playing, right? Like where do they get their conclusions from? How do they make their conclusions about the image of God? Because then maybe we can address how do we make ours. And basically, it's pretty non-controversial. This concept isn't literal, right? When we say we're made in God's image, we're not saying that humans look like God visually. There's plenty in Scripture that talks about God as unseen. Very few have looked upon his face. Only folks like Moses and Job ever get a chance to kind of do that. And so we're not talking about like God's physical appearance that he has 2 eyes and a nose and a mouth and looks like a human. Although, with that said, tell that to the artists, right? Because when we make holy art, we often are going to depict God as having some kind of human form as a way to depict that humans are made in the image of God, which is a metaphor then presented visually, because all holy art is metaphorical. So it all gets kind of combobulated upon itself. Does that make sense? Like it's, we're not talking about what God looks like, except in the sense that we're talking about what God looks like. And indeed, that goes to another level when we start thinking about God as human in the form of Jesus Christ. And that's where you see New Testament authors like Paul playing with the fact that, hey, maybe this mysterious and evocative and kind of curious phrasing in the famous creation narrative in Genesis 1 through 3 was a prophecy of sorts, was a this is something that was a hint that when we saw God and when we looked on his face and saw what he looked like, we would be seeing him in the form of a human man named Jesus Christ. But that's all to say what it isn't, except that it kind of is. What about if we want to say what it is, except that it kind of isn't? What's the wibbly wobbly aspect of the image of God from a positive perspective? It's not literal, it is metaphorical. And what's the metaphor, and how do we figure out what the metaphor is? Well, the way we figure it out is we work backwards. Mankind, Adam is the Hebrew word, was made in the image and likeness of God, and all humankind, it says later that both the man and the woman were made in the image and likeness of God, and so their descendants possess that image. So if we want to know what that image is, we've got to look at us. We've got to look at each other. We've got to ask the question, what is it about us that is like God, that resembles God, that looks like God? And that's where we're going to fill in the blanks of that question with our existing theology. That's where, depending on what else we believe that is important to us about God, we're going to start to see that in ourselves. That's also where we get detractors, we get critics. And I always think that, when there are people that criticize Christianity, we should listen carefully to them, because they often have very insightful things to say. They say, well, you guys created God in your image. Well, yeah, we kind of do. Like, we kind of can't help that. We look at ourselves and we say, okay, well, clearly, like, some parts about me aren't godly, right? Clearly there are some things that I do, but maybe the fact that I have, like, rationality, the fact that I'm sentient, the fact that I have the capability to think about myself and the other animals don't, like, maybe that's a sense of the image-bearingness of God. Or if I look at myself and I say, okay, the fact that I overeat, that's probably not something that's in common with God, but maybe the fact that I'm creative, like the fact God created the heavens and the earth, and I create content for YouTube. And so in this small way, I'm imitating, quite literally, my creator, because I'm being creative. That's another aspect of the image that might be what we're talking about, or might be a part of what we're talking about. The fact that I'm relational, the fact that I desire love, and I crave that and seek that and nurture that in others, is something that seems unique, that the relational aspect of humans, at least the way they relate. Animals also desire love, but not in the same complicated societal ways, so maybe there's something there. And finally, one place that a lot of theologians have gone to is dignity, right? So all through that early creation narrative, it's good, it's good, it's good. I made the fish and they were good, and I made the land and it was good, and God made the humans and they were very good. And so the fact that there's something about humans that, like, matters and seems important, and so every human you meet, whether they're kind or unkind, or whether they're rich or poor, and no matter where they're from, and no matter how old they are, they possess that dignity, and maybe a way to talk about that dignity, that inherent human right, is to talk about the image of God, that all people are bearers of the image of God. And we get to wonder about that. We get to do theology, and we get to let our other theological ideas come in and inform, like, where do you see the image of God in yourself? It's one of the best examples of ways in which, when the more theology we do, the more theology we get to do, right? The more we think about the scriptures, the more scripture there is to think about, because it weaves back upon itself. And so it's a really great question to explore in a format like this. So thank you very much for asking it, Jonathan. If you've got a follow-up question, I hope you'll ask that too. If anybody else out there has a question, or if you've got another unrelated question, I hope you like that. And if you think this is a good answer, I want to ask you to do me a favor and share it. Put it up on your Facebook profile or your YouTube channel or your TikTok or whatever the heck, and get this out there. Say, hey, there's this pastor, he's answering questions. I think he's sincere. I think you should check him out. He's a little sloppy, but he'll get better. Make suggestions, talk to him, send comments, he responds. And we're gonna do a thing. We're gonna make a difference to the gospel on the internet together. This has been Ask the Pastor. See you next time.